Welcome to Between Drinks, a podcast where we travel the world one drink at a time. I'm your host, Carol Griffin, a mezcal sommelier, traveling bartender, and an all-around drinks nerd. In each episode, I'll take you somewhere new to dive into a local drink with a story to tell. We'll talk about its history and how it's made, but also its connection to the place and the people that make it what it is. There's a great story behind every great drink, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thanks for listening.
Coffee is not a cheap product. I think Ben Affleck in his years was a gorgeous man, but when I saw his commercial on Dunkin' Donuts for $1, I was like shocked. I was mortified. I was like, I cannot support this dude anymore.
You were like, he's no longer on my list. No,
not on my list. No, I don't need that. Because I think we have to value the work, the people that are doing this, the challenges they face. So if your cup of coffee becomes slightly more expensive, it's because there's a reason. One, I think we haven't paid them enough for the last 50 years. Secondly, we have to now do better. And maybe I would not recommend drinking less. I would recommend making smarter decisions on where you're drinking your coffee.
That was my friend, Vera Espindola Rafael. She's a development economist who works with coffee supply chains to make them more inclusive, ethical, sustainable, all that good stuff. I don't consider myself a coffee person per se, but I am surrounded by coffee people. They're not all as knowledgeable about coffee as Vera, because almost no one is, but their cumulative good taste and 6 years in Mexico have taught me a lot. They've turned me from someone who only drank dirty chai lattes into someone who, mostly still just orders like a basic iced latte, but can no longer stomach them from just anywhere. So why are we talking about my coffee preferences on a podcast about booze? Because Between Drinks is about drinks, first and foremost. Sometimes those are fermented drinks like beer and wine, and usually they're spirits like whiskey and rum. But a drink doesn't have to have alcohol to be widely influential or tell us about a place. I learned this firsthand during my nomad phase, when I spent years working remotely from coffee shops around the world. It made me realize that there are countries that drink coffee, countries that have a coffee culture where people drink it at cafes and care about the quality or preparation, and even fewer still with a good cafe culture. Cafes are to coffee what bars are to booze. They are the meeting point where consumers are introduced to new coffees and can learn more about what they like and how it's made. You don't learn about that from the coffee aisle of a grocery store, just like you don't learn about spirits in the aisle of a liquor store. You learn about spirits in a bar, and you learn about coffee in a cafe. Mexico is one of the few places that has both great coffee and a great cafe culture. Mexico City, in particular, has the best cafe culture I've ever seen. The quality of the coffee, the vibes of the cafes, the baristas who know what they're doing, it's unmatched. And a day rarely goes by that I don't step into a cafe. So, between my own preferences, the increased tourism here, and the coffee lovers in my life who've come to visit from countries all over the world, I've noticed that Mexican coffee always comes as a bit of a surprise to foreigners and even to locals. Which is unfortunate, because Mexico does have coffee, great coffee, but it's not well known around the world, and I wanted to understand why.
So I studied development economics. And the reason why I started to study this is because in part, both of my families come from farming families, mostly subsistence farming. And I was always triggered by the level of richness all these campos, all these fields have. And what triggered me most is that for some reason, the countries and the people that were living within these beautiful landscapes, including my family, were never really well off. There was always like struggling. And I had the opportunity to enter this program, which I did. And I think my main objective was to try to understand the context. I love numbers, the microeconomic context on what is needed to change this, what kind of elements need to be changed.
Coffee comes from a type of stone fruit, or cherry, which is native to Africa and Asia. What we call coffee beans are actually the roasted seeds from this fruit. Ethiopia is widely considered to be the birthplace of the plant, but the drink, as we know it today, first became popular in Yemen in the 15th century. It traveled through the Arab world, where it was embraced as an alternative to alcohol. And from there, coffee spread to Europe through the Ottoman Empire's trade routes, and it went on to quite literally change the world. Coffee didn't make it to Mexico until later, when Spanish colonizers brought it to the Americas in the late 1700s, and it was longer still before it became a popular crop. You see, drinks like chocolate and atole were rooted in Mexican culture, and so coffee cultivation didn't initially take off. It took years for coffee plantations to crop up in southern Mexico, and it took even longer for Mexicans to actually start drinking coffee. The thing that changed the tides was the Mexican Revolution, a long civil war that ended in 1917 with an overthrown dictator and a new constitution. It brought on land reforms that redistributed large estates into smaller plots of land, many of which went to indigenous peoples and rural workers who had previously been indentured to large coffee plantations. They used their knowledge to start their own small coffee farms on this land. And in 1958, the government founded a National Coffee Institute to, one, give these farmers much needed support, and two, help establish Mexico as a coffee producing country in the global market. At first, this worked. Rural areas saw a 900% increase in coffee production in just 20 years. So, what happened? Why isn't Mexico this big known deal in the world of international coffee? Most coffee producers are located in what's called the Bean Belt, a region around the equator that includes parts of Central America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In Mexico, most coffee comes from 4 southern states, which makes sense because, that's where the equator is. We've got Chiapas, a southern state that borders Guatemala as the biggest producer. This is where a lot of those original plantations were, and so it's where a lot of land was handed over to those small producers originally. Veracruz, northwest of that, is where coffee was first introduced in Mexico, and they're still a big producer today. Their neighbor, Puebla, is a newer coffee state known for its unique microclimates. And then there's Oaxaca, which is known for its small traditional production. But really, all Mexican coffee comes from small traditional production and small producers. No one's counted them since 2017, but it's estimated that we have around 500,000 coffee producers. The vast majority are indigenous. They're farming small plots of land no bigger than 3 hectares or around 7.5 acres. And they're all pretty much growing the same beans and processing them the same way. And yet, despite those similarities, there's a lot of variety in the flavor profiles themselves.
I think what is a shame is that we have unfortunately not put that more on paper as a country. But even in a region or a state like Oaxaca has around 5 regions that produce coffee. And within those regions, you have a different type of profile. I think that that's a work that still needs to be uncovered, put more on paper. Because if you talk to the cuppers, they would say, no, oh, this is definitely a Chiapas one. I think this is more from Los Altos, There's some efforts being done. For example, I think Veracruz has done a work through the Institute of Cafecol and Inecol. They've done quite some work in order to give every region within Veracruz a profile, a cupping profile. There's similar kind of work being done for Los Altos de Chiapas, that within the Altos de Chiapas, they are trying to give that a specific profile because they're different type of microclimates. The flavor profile of coffee is like wine, mainly because of the terroir they're in and variety that they have. So if you have different varieties, then you already have a different flavor profile. It does depend on those types of externalities.
Simply put, growing coffee in different environments produces different flavor profiles. And then there's the bean itself and the way it's grown and harvested. In Mexico, we almost exclusively grow Arabica coffee, and 90% of it undergoes quote-unquote wet processing. Here's an overview of how it all works from seed to bean. Coffee plants start as seeds. It takes 3 to 4 years from planting to first harvest, and after the first year, it takes about 9 months for the coffee cherries to mature. The plants have to be weeded, pruned, and protected from pests during this time, so it's definitely not a hands-off process. When the plants are ready, the berries are harvested by hand. You only want the bright red, perfectly ripe berries, and so farmers will make several passes of the same field to pick each one at the right time. After harvesting, berries are sorted to remove any unripe or damaged berries that snuck in. The skin and pulp are removed, leaving the mucilage-covered green bean. Those beans are fermented in tanks and then thoroughly rinsed to remove the rest of the mucilage. Afterwards, the beans are spread out on drying beds to dry. And then finally, the outer parchment layer around the bean is removed. All that's left is the green coffee bean, and it's these that are packed for sale and eventually roasted by coffee roasters around the world. Washed coffees like these, where the mucilage is removed before drying, tend to have a cleaner, brighter, and more acidic flavor profile. But in general, I'd say the notes in Mexican coffee lean more nutty and chocolatey. There are sometimes floral notes or notes of citrus, depending on the region, but it's not common to find the big fruity flavors that you find in coffee from some other countries. Mexican coffee has its own profile, and it's really defined by those nutty, chocolatey notes.
Smallholders in that sense, and particularly the ones in coffee, often are dependent on that crop. It's for them a cash crop. It's for them what they know and how to do. So it's very hard to detach yourself from that when you have already that plot of land. You have planted your trees. This is what you know from your dad, mom, or even grandparents. This is what we do. There's a sense of identity that is sometimes hard to explain to other producers that produce different types of things. For example, if you say to a producer from lettuce, please switch to pepino, to cucumber, then well, fine, whatever the market wants. There's a different level of attachment, right? And then in a country like Mexico, we have around 70% of all our producers are indigenous communities. So that gives you a different layer of, I don't want to use the word complexity, I will just say the challenge in that. These are often also in areas which are quite remote. It's not necessarily where all the conditions are in place to make life easy. Lack of infrastructure is also not helping. And then, of course, we also have the part that the indigenous communities where they are also in, some of them mainly also speak their own language. Now, why is that perhaps a challenge? Because a lot of the education material that's out there and presented is mostly not even in Spanish, so let alone in an indigenous language. So when you sum up these challenges, and I will then focus on one which is particular that we have lived for the last, I would say, 40, 50 years in a market where coffee prices have been low, that means that, these producers are often living in poor conditions. And this is not me stating an opinion. This is fundamentado by an ICO report that if you compare countries that produce coffee with countries that don't produce coffee, the ones that produce coffee are more likely to be in poverty than the ones that don't produce coffee. And this is tremendously sad because coffee as a beverage is the beverage which we, in theory, can live without, but we don't want to as a society.
The global coffee industry is estimated to be worth more than $200 billion US, but only 10% of that generated wealth stays in the coffee producing countries. And that's because the vast majority of coffee is exported. And it's exported in a really complex supply chain, and so most of the profit is made by the middlemen, the roasters, and retailers. In a world where inflation is rampant and it feels like everything is getting more expensive, coffee prices, or at least the ones producers are paid for their beans, have actually dropped. At the same time, the countries that produce coffee have more challenges than ever. Political instability, climate change, and its related migration, and then there are pests and diseases and soil fertility. I could go on, but the gist is that coffee has a rough road everywhere, and Mexico is no different. So what are we to do? Well, there's some better choices we can make as consumers, for sure, and we'll talk about those. But there's also some good news at the macro level. Vera actually did a big study recently about how coffee-producing countries can support their producers by building up demand at home. And it boils down to this. The reason coffee is almost always exported from where it's grown is that's how producers used to get the best price. But now that those prices are dropping, domestic markets are more competitive. And when you sell in your own country, there are fewer middlemen, less taxes, duties, and so on. So now, producers in countries like Mexico are finding that they can actually get a better rate by selling their coffee to local buyers. So cultivating a specialty coffee scene in coffee-producing countries with cafes that sell their coffee and consumers who are eager to buy it, it's a great way to grow the domestic market and get more money in those farmers' pockets. This has been a relatively recent change, but it's surely one of the reasons that Mexican coffee isn't being shipped abroad as often. And I can't be mad about it when I understand this reasoning. Also, I mean, I work in coffee, but trust me when I say that me and my coffee budget are doing our part down here in CDMX to build up that local demand. Now that we know how coffee is grown and harvested, let's talk about what happens to those little green beans after they're roasted. Coffee is a huge industry, so there are a bunch of different categories. The majority of the coffee that's produced is what we'll call conventional coffee or commodity coffee. You know, the big brands like Folgers that make the stuff you see in the supermarket. This kind of coffee accounts for about 60% of the market, followed by instant coffee or soluble coffee, which is another 15 to 20%. These coffees are usually a blend of different types from different regions, and so you usually don't see any information on the package about where the beans are from. On the flip side, high-quality coffee is usually referred to as specialty coffee. Specialty coffee has a high rating on what's called the Q scale, which we'll talk more about in a bit. It's what you buy directly from a local roaster or at a cafe where you can clearly see details like country of origin, the type of bean, the flavor notes. And these coffees account for about 10 to 15% of the market.
So can I ask what grade is the coffee? Is that a faux pas to ask? I don't know I know there's the scale and I'm like somewhat familiar with it, but like obviously a 96 or 90, that's like almost impossible to,
This is a very funny question because quite a few years ago, having 100 points coffee, which is like the top, was essentially technically impossible.
Yeah.
Till this Panama coffee came by and was the Nadia Comaneci of the coffee. and they were like, had to remake the whole grading around the coffee.
They were like, hold my beer, I mean coffee.
Exactly. Like we have to, like raise our standards in order to not surpass the 100 points. We actually had one of those. It was a Presentation 90 Plus back in 2018, I think. And it was 98 points. So it's like the 1% of the 1% of the 1% of coffee.
Served at your neighborhood cafe in Roma Norte.
Trust me, it spoiled everybody. But also, it was like, I don't know, having generous wine or having an Oporto. Or if you close your eyes and somebody tells you it is not coffee, you might be like, oh, what is this? Like, this is not coffee. What's so different?
It transcends coffee to another level.
Exactly.
That was Mauricio Subirats, or Mao. He's a chef and owner of one of my favorite cafes in Mexico City, Raku Cafe. Raku is a Japanese-inspired cafe, but they proudly serve Mexican specialty coffee. Specialty coffee is any coffee that scores 80 or above on a grading system that was developed by the Specialty Coffee Association. They certify experts called Q graders to evaluate coffee with a process called cupping. Anything below 80 is considered commercial grade, and it's sold for those big commercial or commodity coffee brands we just talked about. Now, Mao is a coffee snob of the highest degree. He spends an inordinate amount of time cupping his coffee and fine-tuning his espresso machine, and it's made Raku well known for having really great Mexican coffee specifically, which is a little ironic because he didn't originally serve coffee from Mexico.
We were serving international beans at a time, and we were maybe one of the few specialty coffee shops in Mexico City that actually sold international roasted abroad coffees in Mexico City. Then this amazing coffee roaster came by and he was like, we can definitely do something great with Mexican beans. And he opened my eyes towards all the incredible, insane specialty coffee that you can get in Mexico. Like, they're going to be obviously very different from what you can get from Ethiopia or Panama or whatever, but they're also incredible in Mexico.
This, in a sense, is what started me down this rabbit hole into Mexican coffee. Mexican coffee can be great. It has unique flavor profiles, about half of it is considered specialty coffee quality, and yet even people who love coffee have never really heard of it. So again, why is that?
Specialty coffees movement started in the 90s, and the specialty coffee movement itself has been through different phases. where when we started to understand really where coffee was from, I have to say, I was already working in coffee. And then people started to ask, so which country, which region is it? This is 2010. So it's not that we are talking like a bottle of wine, which has a different history and understanding that we want to know where it's from. That movement of coffee, of that third wave, is very recent. So when we're starting to uncover other countries that produce this, and Mexico being one of them, I would say other countries with their infrastructure, they started to invest a little bit more than we did. I think that Mexico, I would say in the last 8 years, has started more to focus on producing differentiated coffee, specialty coffee, understanding that that potential was there. And there have been different initiatives that helped us as consumers and part of the sector understand that basically we do have great quality coffee. It's simply a matter of wanting and creating a market for it. And one of the great and cool things that happened very organically is that the Mexican consumer itself started to ask for it more. And I think that that has helped and shaped the consumption of specialty coffee in Mexico.
You know how I told you that Mexico started a National Coffee Institute to support farmers and grow Mexico's coffee reputation abroad? Well, they shut that institute down in 1989. The government made a bunch of economic reforms, and so it was a casualty of those. And unfortunately, that was around the time that third wave coffee exploded. Third wave coffee emphasizes single origin coffees, lighter roasting, and artisanal brewing methods. It was the first time that coffee at scale was treated as a craft product, similar to wine or craft beer. It was when a lot of people first started to pay attention to where their coffees came from, and Mexican producers didn't get to fully capitalize on that. Was that entirely because the institute closed? No, but it was one factor. And some of the other factors are that Mexican producers are very small. They're less quote unquote productive when you look at how much they produce per hectare. They're more isolated. And so they don't have the support or resources that producers in some more established countries do. And now, in recent years, an increasing amount of Mexican coffee is staying in Mexico because that's where producers can get a better price. And, we talked about this. Can actually be a good thing in a lot of ways. But there is one area where Mexico does come up a lot in the coffee conversation abroad.
I don't know why there are no many super high quality beans in different places. For example, we just went to Japan, as you said, and I took Raku coffee to different places, like some of the best coffee shops in the world, maybe, with incredible baristas that are like world champion barista of whatever. They're insanely professional and they've tasted coffees from all over the world. And every time that I had the same answer. It was like, oh, so we thought that Mexico only had decaf. That is kind of infuriating at the same time. It's kind of exhausting. And it's like, oh, decaf. I'm like, no, I don't ever drink decaf.
Never.
But people in Japan, for example, they always think that Mexico only has decaf to offer.
So this is a little bit of an aside, but I want to talk about decaffeinated coffee for a quick sec. Decaf coffee is a pretty niche market, and I'm not in that market. So I never gave decaf much thought until I started drinking specialty coffee in Mexico and then started talking about it abroad. I'd wander into a specialty coffee shop in, say, Europe or Japan, and very rarely I'd see a Mexican coffee and comment on it, or more likely I'd get into a conversation about coffee with a barista, and I'd mention Mexican coffee, and I'd get something like, "You mean decaf?" It was all very perplexing, especially because when I brought it up to coffee-loving friends in Mexico, some of them had had similar experiences, but also couldn't explain why Mexico seems to be associated with decaf abroad. And then I talked to Vera about it.
We have one of the biggest decaf plants in the world in Córdoba. I think in the world there are 5 to 10. And the biggest ones, one of the biggest ones are here in Mexico, in Córdoba. There are two patented methods. One of them is owned by this Mexican family. So a lot of the coffee from Africa that wants the mountain water process patent, they are exported to Mexico. It's brought in to Cordoba, it's decaffeinated, and then sent back to either Germany or whatever European country they drink their decaf coffee in.
And suddenly, it all made sense.
There are a lot of people that love to talk about how you prepare a certain coffee, which has to do with the bean size, the bean density. So another rabbit hole, I should just said, yeah.
Absolutely. Rhea and I went to Querétaro last week, and we went to El Apapacho?
Papacho, sí, Papacho.
Oh my God, their coffee bar is made in a government laboratory for people like Rhea. She was in heaven, and when she ordered a bag to go, they even pulled out a little pre-printed card and they wrote down all the brewing instructions. So they're like, okay, you use a Chemex? Do you hand grind? Like, you need 30 rotation. And it was like, I'd never seen anyone
Love it.
give the card with the bag. And I was like, this was amazing. Even when they served my like geisha variety, it was like they had like a little printed card and the bean was taped to it. It had all the details. And I was like, I wish every beverage came with this level of detail and context.
Yes.
So that we could really appreciate everything that goes into it.
Yes. I actually really enjoy that because I do think it's part of understanding that coffee is not just coffee.
Mm-hmm.
It has multiple layers and it's beautiful. Yeah.
That was Vera and me geeking out about a cafe in Querétaro called Apapacho. And Rhea is the one who really got me into coffee in the first place. She used to work in specialty coffee. So when we moved in together, the smell of beautiful coffee just started wafting up the stairs at predictable intervals. And thanks to her, I do know how brewing works on a theoretical level. So let's go through it. A cup of coffee is about 98% water, and the rest is called TDS, or total dissolved solids. The more TDS, the stronger your brewed coffee. The longer the coffee and water are in contact, the more coffee compounds are extracted. And a finer grind increases surface area, which causes extraction to happen faster. Other factors like water quality and temperature, type of filter, and brew method also play a role. And the brew method could be a Chemex, a V60, a standard countertop coffee maker, or seemingly a million other things. I feel like I'm constantly discovering new ones. Rhea literally wrote a book on this subject, so I'll link to it in the show notes for anyone interested in going down this whole rabbit hole of brewing, because brewing is a rabbit hole, but it's also a pretty special one.
I'm passionate about beverages in general, but what makes coffee my absolute favorite, and Mexican coffee in particular, is that coffee is equal, I think, in complexity to like wine or a spirit or something like that. But then there's like this whole other side and like stage of influence that the barista or the consumer has over it. You can't just pour coffee out of a bottle. There are like hundreds of little decisions you can make to tailor coffee to your preferences. It's a beautiful collaboration between the bean and the drinker that I think really honors the work of the people who labored to get it to you. That is 1,000% part of the reason I'm totally fine taking 30 minutes in the morning to make my own coffee. Not for everybody, but if you know, you know. And if you get it, you get it.
That was Rhea herself highlighting something that's really unique about coffee, and that's the collaboration, as she puts it. There's no other beverage that works this way. Even the best, most artisanal beer, wine, or spirits, they come out of a bottle as they are. But good coffee isn't poured out of a bottle. It's brewed by you or by your friendly neighborhood barista.
Our espresso, if I'm not wrong, this year was like 89 points, which is not extremely high, but it is really good for like having a daily coffee. Mm-hmm. And it is an anaerobic fermentation process. So with the right equipment and the right knowledge, you're able to take out way more from a coffee than you would do with a regular espresso machine, for example, or without all the daily experimentation that we've been through like over this like 6 years with the machine that we have now. Mm-hmm. We started with a Mirzoko GS3, which is like the starting kit for every specialty coffee shop in the world, maybe. And we changed into Slayer's Team LP, which is an American machine based in Seattle. They changed your coffee game forever. Like the espresso game was a totally different one because you have a lot of different variables that you can control. You can play with pre-infusion, post-infusion, extraction, temperature. And so even with 89 points, you can get an incredible espresso that you might not be able to get with a 90-something on a regular machine.
Baristas in cafes play an important role in coffee because of the control they have over your coffee. The right brew method, the right barista, the right adjustments to your espresso machine, they can take a good coffee and make it great. And Mexican baristas in particular, I feel like know what they're doing. It's one of the many reasons why I love the cafe culture here. But there are good cafes around the world. Maybe not quite as many as we have, but good cafes serving good coffee that's brewed well. But how do you take it a step further? How do you choose the right beans when there are multiple types on offer? And how do you know if your coffee is coming from an ethical source that pays producers what they deserve?
Then you can ask a question if it's not explained to you when you order it at a cafe, explain where. Well, it's from Honduras. Which part of Honduras? Ask that question. Is it from a co-op? Is it not from a co-op? Okay. It doesn't define necessarily that they were paid fairly. It does give you an indication how that supply chain is working. Because I have been in a situation where you ask those questions, well, Honduras, I don't know, north, south, and they just want to continue with their lives. I'm like, then you don't care. Do I want to continue here for the vibe? Maybe. But I, as a consumer, do care where the coffee comes from. And maybe I will go somewhere else where they do give me that, explanation where a specific coffee comes from. So, for example, if you ask me, where I'm going to Chicago next week, do you know a roaster that cares? Yes. For example, Metric Coffee cares. Metric Coffee has sit with me and done the numbers and said, Vera, so what if we give more to the producer and you get less as an exporter? Those are the roasters that you want to drink coffee from. And I would say, yes, it's a little bit of asking, but even their staff would know because it's a roaster that puts it in their staff, in their education information, that I think it's very important to do that, So ask where it's from. How are you paying the producers, or how are you assuring that the producers paid better? And I think that those are easy questions and maybe sparks a different conversation. And maybe they don't know, but they're also eager to find out for you. Who knows?
It's funny because every time I talk to a coffee person about supporting good producers and buying ethically made coffee, they give me the same answer that I give people about mezcal. For those of you who don't know, I'm a mezcal sommelier and I have a lot of feelings about it. People ask me for bottle recommendations all the time, and I think often they're just expecting me to rattle off some brands, which I can do, but it's also less straightforward than that. Because it's an artisanal product with limited quantities, you can't buy the same bottles everywhere. You have to ask questions. And even if you don't know the quote-unquote right answers, the fact that the answers are clearly printed on the bottle or readily available from the person selling it to you, well, that's a good sign. It means you're on the right track. And coffee works the same way. The fact that a bag of coffee beans has detailed information about where it's from, how it was made, and what the flavor notes are does not automatically mean it's an ethically made coffee or even a good coffee, but it means you're on the right track. So if you're at a coffee shop selling specialty coffee, ask the questions. If they're offering a lineup of single origin coffees and selling bags of their coffee at a premium, they should be able to answer basic questions about where it's from and who's making it. And as long as you're not asking during a big rush, they should even be excited to tell you. But if they're not, that's a sign. Maybe you order anyway. You have a meeting to get to, or you're meeting a friend there. Maybe you need a quick cup of caffeine the next time you're at an airport and you get that $1 Ben Affleck endorsed coffee from Dunkin' Donuts. We've all done it. Well, maybe not Rhea and Vera, but I definitely have, so I hear you. The answer is rarely perfection, but effort. Make the effort to learn a little bit more about what you're drinking and make decisions accordingly. Maybe that means you stop going through the drive-thru altogether, or maybe it just means making sure a few more of the cups you drink each week come from better sources. Most of us are creatures of habit, and so even doing the research once can have a big impact. Check out the cafes and roasters near you, verify that they're worth your support, and then just keep supporting them. Those people in the fields who handpick every single berry that's going to turn into your morning coffee, they deserve that much, right? And that's really what I hope you take away from this whole season on Mexican Drinks. A little bit of effort from a lot of people can make a big impact. And as a bonus, that effort will pay off in the form of some really good drinks. Well, that's all for this season, folks. Mexico's home, so I'm sure we'll be back soon enough. There are so many more beverages that I could dive into. But I'm also excited for the next season, which will be about, drum roll, Japan. I've spent almost 6 months exploring Japan over the last few years, and I recently got back from yet another trip where I dove into a few of the many great drinks being made there. Those delicious bevies will be the focus of the next season, and it will be coming to a podcast player near you super soon. In the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter. I write about the overlap between travel, culture, and drinks. It's where I share a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff that goes into making these apps, as well as just general travel stories and recommendations for your next trip. You can subscribe at betweendrinks.co/Mexican coffee. You'll also find there the show notes, transcript, and some additional recs for Mexican coffee and where to look for it in the US and abroad. Thanks for listening. I hope to see you on our virtual trip to Japan next season.